Number 10. ALCHEMX. ALCHEMX is the villainous corporation that exists in the alternate future of 2099, Earth 928. It is where Miguel O'Hara once worked and came up with the procedure that would ultimately grant him his powers. He was a brilliant geneticist that worked for ALCHEMX, but didn't like that he was being pressured to rush along his research and begin trials that he believed were unethical. When Miguel tried to leave ALCHEMX after a test subject died from the procedure, the CEO, Tyler Stone, attempted to prevent him from leaving by getting him addicted to a drug only ALCHEMX produced, called Rapture, which is also apparently a highly addictive substance, so not so great for Miguel. Fortunately, Miguel would end up curing himself, getting spider-like powers, and end up escaping ALCHEMX, at least for the time being. ALCHEMX and Stone, however, weren't willing to let him escape so easily, and they would continue to pursue him. It's possible ALCHEMX could end up being the main big bad of it all in Across the Spider-Verse Part 1, and maybe Part 2, and however many other parts there will be. Number 9. VULTURE. While I imagine we will get to see some of Miguel O'Hara's villains as we head to the future of 2099, I would also love it if we get to meet some of Spider-Man Noir's as well. In the reality of the Noirverse, Earth 90214, VULTURE is actually a terrifying villain who Spider-Man Noir also has a pretty personal vendetta against. In that reality, VULTURE is the one who is personally responsible for killing Peter's Uncle Ben. He was ordered by the Green Goblin of the Noirverse to do this, but still he was ultimately the one responsible. VULTURE here is a carnival geek. That is a person who travels around with a carnival and, not having any particular skill sets of their own, usually performs by biting the heads off of live animals. VULTURE went down this road and ended up with a very acquired taste for human flesh. As such, he devoured Peter's Uncle Ben. Later on, Spider-Man Noir would kill the Vulture for what he'd done, when he later attempted to kill his Aunt May. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to learn about more amazing multiversal villains and just, spider villains in general, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. And let us know if there's anyone in particular you want to learn more about. Number 8. The Lizard. The Lizard of Earth 65 is the version we are talking about here. On Earth 65, the same reality that Spider-Gwen hails from in the comics, Lizard is actually none other than Peter Parker. Peter Parker is best friends with Gwen Stacy, and after she becomes the spider-like superpowered hero in this reality, in his place, he wants nothing more than to be like her. He does not know, of course, that this hero, his hero, is actually his friend Gwen. Done with being bullied and having to have Gwen stick up for him as well, he creates a serum which he uses on himself. It gives him power, but it also turns him into the monster and villain known as Lizard, as his reptile self takes over. The Lizard ends up dying when he comes up against Spider-Gwen and is only then revealed to be Peter Parker, Gwen's best friend. He dies in her arms. It's all pretty tragic. We saw an allusion to this part of Gwen and Peter's stories from Earth 65 in Gwen's origin flashback in Into the Spider-Verse. But what if Peter didn't die? What if he's still alive and he somehow returns? That would be intense for Gwen to deal with. Perhaps he's an alternate of this alternate who is still alive, or perhaps, like I said, the Lizard didn't really die in Gwen's universe. There are multiple approaches you could take here. I personally would love to see him come back because I just would love to see their dynamic. Number 7. Ultimatum. Ultimatum is actually an alternate and evil version of Miles Morales in the comics, who hails from the main continuity of Earth 616. You see, in the comics, Miles is actually not from the main continuity, not originally, but instead from an alternate universe, the universe of Earth 1610, known as the Ultimate Universe, because that was the line of comics that it was a part of. The Ultimates themselves were actually a superhero team akin to Earth 616's Avengers. On Earth 616, Miles Morales was a criminal who ended up traveling for a time to Earth 1610. When he returned home to Earth 616, he learned that Miles Morales of 1610 was also residing there. Resentful of the other Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and wanting him out of his way, he aimed to send Miles and his family back to their home reality of Earth 1610, against their will, obviously. Fortunately, Miles and his uncle, Aaron Davis, aka Prowler, who also wound up resurrected and on Earth 616, foiled the plot of Ultimatum, defeating him. At least for now. Miles is such a sweetheart in the animated Spider-Verse reality, so I'd really love to see him fight against someone who is very much his opposite. I definitely want to see Miles take on his evil version. Number 6. Peter Parker 2099. In an alternate 2099 future, not the same reality that Miguel is from, Peter Parker actually becomes the CEO of ALCHEMX, the villainous corporation that Spider-Man 2099 once worked for. In this reality, Peter Parker was still Spider-Man, but allowed the public to believe that the hero was dead. Retired from heroics, he he became the CEO of Alchemax, working sort of in secret because, you know, he's supposed to be dead. His plan was to fix his past mistakes and bring back all of those people whom he couldn't save during his time as Spider-Man. This alternate version of Peter also has a prolonged lifespan due to fancy future anti-aging technology, so that's how he's still alive, by the way. He attempts to get Miguel from the alternate 2099 reality, which is I guess really the main 2099 reality, and his own younger self to join him, but both refuse, prompting 2099 Peter to fight Miguel. This evil version of Spider-Man I think could fit well into Across the Spider-Verse as a main antagonist, considering his whole plot involves rewriting reality, which, you know, could potentially affect and threaten the entire multiverse. 2099 Peter Parker comes from the Spider-Man video game Edge of Time, where he was revealed as the main antagonist. Or well, he ended up kind of being the main antagonist I guess at the end of the game. Also, while Edge of Time wasn't well received, and I know that, the story in general was praised. And I think the story is pretty cool, so yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Number 5. Superior Spider-Man. Superior Spider-Man is a version of Spider-Man who is also Dr. Otto Octavius. Let me explain. Back in the 616 comic book continuity, Otto is basically dying and manages to trick Peter into a body swap scenario. While Peter is trapped inside Otto's failing body and dies, Otto lives on in Peter's body as Spider-Man. Superior Spider-Man to be exact, because you know, this is Otto, so he's like, I'm gonna be the best Spider-Man ever. Peter would eventually return, and Otto would also go back to his usual Doc Ock appearance and his hijinks, but for a time, he was the Spider-Man of the 616 reality. He's done good and bad things before in the comics, and ended up accidentally bringing back the Inheritors after they were defeated the first time in Spiderverse. Oops. Superior Spider-Man, while known for being a villain, is also like an anti-hero, so we could really see him in either light were he to show up in Across the Spider-Verse Part 1. But yeah, he's been a villain and a hero, so I figured I could still count him as a villain for this list. I just really want Superior Spider-Man. I think a lot of us do. Number 4. Army of Doc Ocks. Why stop at 1? Or I guess 2 Doc Ocks when we could have a whole army of them, right? I mean, there isn't just Doc Ock, Otto Octavius somewhere out there. We also have Olivia Liv, Octavius's version, and we could have Superior Spider-Man as well. There are lots of cool alternates of Otto out in the multiverse that we could meet in Across the Spider-Verse, and Doc Ock is such a powerful and interesting villain that we could have a whole army of them to face. I'm not sure what the motivation would be, or like who would ultimately be the Doc Ock in charge, the like head Doc Ock. Maybe Superior, but I'm sure when all those octopi put their minds and I guess their tentacles together, they could come up with some pretty ingenious schemes. Also, I feel like now that I said put their tentacles together, I'm like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I said it. And you know what? Sometimes you gotta be like all tentacles in and then get your mind out of the gutter. Number 3. The Spider. The Spider is one of the worst alternate versions of Spider-Man we've ever met. He is super evil and is basically a version of Peter Parker that is combined with Cletus Cassidy. This alternate version of Peter Parker has red hair and was born a sociopath, because I guess everyone that has red hair is a sociopath. I don't know. I don't understand that connection, but you know, people with red hair, apparently they have no souls. He possesses a dark sense of humor and enjoys causing pain to others. He first showed up in the Exile series and hails from Earth 15. Like Carnage on Earth 616, he revels in hurting others. He possesses a symbiote very similar to Carnage, although it is actually known as the Spider symbiote instead of the Carnage symbiote in this reality. What could be cooler than seeing Miles and the rest of the Spider Army take on an alternate and evil version of Peter Parker? Also, Let There Be Carnage did well at the box office, right? I'm pretty sure it did. So wouldn't it make sense to have some kind of version of Carnage show up here? And this is like both. It's like a Spidey and a Carnage together. Number 2. MORLUN. I'm actually a really big fan of MORLUN, even though I feel like he's not really everybody's cup of tea. He's my cup of tea. I like the fact that he's a Victorian style energy vampire from an alternate past. MORLUN feeds on the energy of spider totems, hunting them down and feeding off of them. He is extremely powerful by himself and is sometimes not even just a one energy vampire kind of deal. So sometimes if you're facing MORLUN, it's not just MORLUN you're facing. MORLUN is proven to be a hard foe to beat, especially because he rarely stays dead for long and usually shows back up to torment Spider-Man and taunt him, often threatening that he will be his end. MORLUN is also the guy who ate Spider-Man's eye that one time when he was on the brink of death, plagued by a mysterious ailment. Number 1. The Inheritors. The Inheritors are the rest of MORLUN's crew and family. They are a powerful energy vampire clan which hunt down various totems and consume them. Because Yeah, there aren't just spider totems out there apparently. There's lots of other totems. Spider totems, by the way, if you're confused by what that means, are basically spider folks from across the multiverse who are destined to end up being connected to the spirit of the spider, either possessing powers related to spiders or some other important connection, which generally gives them purpose in their life. The inheritors ended up getting control over the Master Weaver, thereby turning him into an enemy of the spider totems, even though that wasn't his intended purpose to begin with. They used the Master Weaver's knowledge and power to travel the multiverse and hunt down spider totems within it. The inheritors are generally led by Solus or Morlun, and their members have included Verna, Genix, Karn, Bora, Brix, Dora, Deimos, Malos, Mortia, Namura, and Thanos. And I probably said some of those wrong, so sorry about that. Like Morlun, they are also from the alternate reality of Earth 001. And in case you didn't know, the inheritors were kind of like the main thing when we had Spider-Verse in the comics and then Spider-Geddon. So it would make sense that they would show up at some point in these movies. Please, I would like to see it. Maybe I'm the only one? I don't know. Number 10, Doctor Doom. I love Doctor Doom, he just looks so cute, but of course this is still a Doctor Doom alternate, so I imagine they're still quite menacing. Doctor Doom is just what he sounds like, an anthropomorphic duck who also happens to have a similar appearance and attitude to Doctor Doom of Earth 616. He makes an appearance as an adversary in the first issue of Peter Porker the Spectacular Spider-Ham. Being a cartoon version of Doctor Doom, aka Victor Von Doom, Doctor Doom also hails from the reality of Spider-Hams, Earth 8311. We also learn in his first appearance that against his own will or his own interests, Doctor Doom happens to be a well-liked rock star, becoming famous against his wishes. He was trying to create his own rock group and make money off of them, but instead he ended up in the limelight despite his protests. Number 9. Killer KRAVINOFFS. The Killer KRAVINOFFS are the grandchildren of KRAVEN the Hunter from the dystopian post-apocalyptic reality of Old Man Logan and Old Man Hawkeye, Earth 807128. With KRAVEN no longer around to hunt, in his place are his grandchildren. There are 3 of them, but only one ends up actually getting a name. Sadly, their existence in the comics is short-lived for how cool they look and should be as descendants of KRAVEN. They only appear in one issue of Old Man Hawkeye, showing up in issue number 4. They run into Marshall Bullseye there and actually end up getting killed by him. And friends, before we move on to the next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to learn about even more alternate villains, there are so many alternate Spider-Man villains I could tell you about, so be sure to hit that like button. Number 8. KARN. KARN ends up becoming the Great Weaver, an ally to the Spider Totems in the end. Spider Totems are spider-like superpowered beings who actually receive their powers through fate rather than circumstance, as we were initially led to believe with heroes like Spider-Man. KARN was a member of the Inheritors, a coven of energy vampires who feed on various animal kingdom totems such as the spider variety, Spider Totems. After KARN was blamed for the death of his mother, he was made to work to atone his misdeeds. He traveled around various multiverses hunting down spider totems at the behest of the other inheritors, though he never really enjoyed it and thus was a reluctant villain. When the previous Master Weaver ended up dead, KARN decided to take his place and instead became an ally to the Spider Army as opposed to a villain of theirs. He did however kill spider totems back when he was hunting and working for the Inheritors, and a member of the Inheritors really. Like his fellow inheritors, KARN hails from the reality of Earth 001 and Loom World, which is their home world. Number 7. KINGPIG. KINGPIG is Spider-Ham's version of Kingpin. As such, KINGPIG hails from the same reality of Earth 8311. He is, as you guessed it, one big mean pig, who also happens to be a major crime lord, like his 616 counterpart. However, while Kingpin in the comics is more into drug rings and other organized crime, KINGPIG is into smuggling cheese and running the cheese market. Now I want cheese. KINGPIG operated in secret, and despite the police trying to uncover who was behind the crimes in their town of Hackawatami, Wisconsin, KINGPIG managed to be too sneaky for them to catch. In the end, it was up to Spider-Ham to discover just who was behind all this illegal activity. We already had Kingpin show up as the villain in Into the Spider-Verse, so how funny and great would it be to see his Toon counterpart in Across the Spider-Verse. Also, I'd really like to go to Spider-Ham's reality, if we get a reality hop, which I think we're gonna get to do that. Number 6. Goblin. In the noir verse of Earth 90214, Green Goblin's counterpart is simply known as Goblin. Here Norman Osborn is still a ruthless villain who is the major crime boss in New York and leads his own villainous group known as the Enforcers. The Enforcers are made up of former carnival freaks who each have their own unique talents, featuring characters like the noir verse's Vulture and Chameleon. Goblin turned to a life of crime because he was mistreated, himself being a circus freak who was ridiculed for his scaly, green, reptile-like skin. Goblin in the comics is the one who is ultimately responsible for the death of Peter Parker's Uncle Ben and for the death of Ben Urich, the reporter and Felicia Hardy's former lover in this reality. Number 5. Patton Parnell. Patton Parnell has to be one of my favorite of the evil alternate Spider-Men out there, and I think he would make a bomb villain in Across the Spider-Verse Part 1, especially if we get some kind of League of Evil Spider-Men. Patton Parnell is the alternate Spider-Man from Earth 51412. Like the Spider, who is on Part 1 of our list, Parnell also has some sociopathic tendencies and enjoys recreational activities like burning ants with a magnifying glass. He ends up becoming a Spider-Man in a more literal sense, becoming a spider-like monstrosity who is also capable of laying eggs, as his Uncle Ted, who also appears to mistreat young Patton, finds out. Rather than Patton Parnell having an origin story of fantasy and heroism, his origin is basically more like a horror story, where Patton ends up as a murderous, monstrous, spider-like villain who develops a taste for human flesh and terrorizes his next-door neighbor and crush, Sarah Jane. Number 4. Tyler Stone. We talked about ALCHEMX, the villainous future corporation, on the Part 1 to our list, and even an alternate video game reality where Peter ends up as the man behind that corporation, but we have yet to focus on the vice president of ALCHEMX's R&D department in the main 2099 reality of Earth 928, Tyler Stone. Tyler Stone is not only VP of Research and Development at ALCHEMX, but also is secretly Miguel O'Hara's biological father. Tyler Stone had an affair with the wife of one of his employees, Conchata, who is Miguel's mother. Miguel doesn't learn until later on that he is the son of Stone, and ends up on the staff of ALCHEMX, working as a brilliant geneticist for them. When he tries to leave, however, it is Stone who slips him the highly addictive drug only made by ALCHEMX known as Rapture, to prevent him from leaving. Fortunately, Miguel manages to free himself via experimentation, which also gives him spider-like powers and abilities, becoming Spider-Man 2099. Number 3. Spider-CARNAGE. Similar to the Spider on Part 1 of our list, Spider-CARNAGE is another evil alternate version of Peter Parker, or at least he thinks he's Peter Parker. Spider-CARNAGE came into being following Miles Warren cloning Peter. In this reality, Peter lost his Uncle Ben and later also his Aunt May, which left him completely broken-hearted. His state of mind was only made worse when he was made to believe the version who had escaped Miles, dyeing his hair blonde and taking up the name Ben Reilly, might actually be the true Peter Parker, with Peter potentially being the clone. This revelation filled Peter with hatred for Ben, and would later fuel the bond he had with the Carnage symbiote, who entered his world via an interdimensional portal during a time when Peter fought Ben. His rage and the symbiote turned him into a villain known as Spider-CARNAGE, and his plan was to destroy all realities across the multiverse. This version of Spider-CARNAGE appeared in the 90s animated Spider-Man television series. Number 2. Red Goblin. Red Goblin isn't necessarily an alternate variant considering he is the main reality 616 Norman Osborn, but Superior Spider-Man is also technically Earth 616's Otto Octavius, and I counted him last time without much complaint, so I figured we could put Red Goblin on this list and it should be fine. Red Goblin is a villain that comes from a period in Marvel Comics where a depowered Norman Osborn ended up getting his hands on the Carnage symbiote and convincing it to bond with him, with both of them bonding over how they enjoyed hurting and tormenting people. Yikes. The Carnage symbiote also helped to cure Norman Osborn of the antidote that was blocking him from using the Goblin serum to regain his previous power set. So this version comes with both the powers of Carnage and those of Green Goblin. Plus you get the brilliant and twisted minds of Norman and Carnage combined. Who doesn't want Red Goblin? He's such a cool villain. Put him in Across the Spider-Verse! Number 1. Evil Spider-Man Army. With the potential for characters like PATTON Parnell, Spider-CARNAGE, Earth 65's Lizard, Ultimatum, Superior Spider-Man, The Spider, and Peter Parker 2099 to show up, it seems plausible that we could get a whole evil Spider-Man army, or evil Spider army, in Across the Spiderverse. I don't know about you, but I'd love to see some evil Spider-Men team up to take on the heroic Spider folks we've come to know and love from the previous film and beyond in the comics. I think that would be super cool. The reality is, in the multiverse, we don't even need an external threat. The threat could simply be Spider-Man himself, considering there are so many great evil possibilities that appear throughout the catalog of Marvel's multiversal realities.
In at 10, Sin Eater. Stanley Carter's parents were addicts who ended up falling in love with each other. Stanley's father, though, later died, leaving Stanley's mother pregnant and alone. Stanley's mother was sent to a rehabilitation clinic, and Stanley went to be raised by his grandparents in the Ozark Mountains. Stanley's grandfather was a zealous pastor who reveled his son and took it out on Stanley. After Stanley's grandfather died due to a rattler bite, this congregation held a sin-eating ritual for him, and young Stanley presumably saw a Sin Eater, a masked hermit who would eat fruit placed in the corpse of someone's body to take the dead sins for himself, because you know that's not gonna screw up a child's development. Stanley ended up joining the NYPD and became a detective after growing up, having multiple instances of executing criminals, particularly drug traffickers, including his own partner. This is where he really became the Sin Eater, a maniacal serial killer and probably one of Spider-Man's scariest foes with no powers, but with the MO of killing anyone who sins. The Sin Eater's first victim was actually his own lover, police captor Jean DeWolf, whose death attracted attention throughout all New York City, including their friend Spider-Man. The Sin Eater had stolen DeWolf's purse, creating a precedent of taking one personal object for each of his victims, and this object would usually have to be associated with the victim's sin in some way. It's probably going to be a loose way, but yeah. In at 9, Atrocity. Introduced and only seen in the Spider-Man game Spider-Man Edge of Time from 2011, Atrocity was created after ANTI-VENOM went into a blind rage, accidentally knocked Otto Octavius and Walker Sloan into Walker Sloan's gateway. It was like a time gateway. The three fused in the space-time continuum. I tried getting Taylor to put this on a list for ages, so I'm gonna put it here because holy damn, this is one hell of a villain that I want to see come back. Atrocity would occasionally attack Peter Parker or Miguel O'Hara with its teleporting tentacles throughout their journey in Alchemax's building, until it eventually revealed itself and attacked Peter Parker. Atrocity was defeated but would later appear again, attempting to kill Peter Parker at the same time the CEO was fighting Miguel O'Hara. Peter manipulated Atrocity into attacking electrified pillars, stunning it. Peter took this opportunity to remove those tentacles and send them through the time gateway. These tentacles were also used to drain the Alchemax CEO of his powers. After both Atrocity and the CEO, who is revealed to be Peter Parker, were vulnerable, they were knocked into the gateway together simultaneously, resetting the timeline. This absolute monstrosity is able to teleport through time and space, in addition to all of his other powers. So yeah, Atrocity for sure needs to make a comeback. I want to see this guy. He only appeared once. He's probably one of the most horrifying looking villains of all time. Please. And at 8, Mr. Negative. Martin Lee was a seemingly good-willed philanthropist who ran a volunteer soup kitchen called Feast, where May Parker volunteered, because of course she did. While he was also the crime boss of Chinatown, Mr. Negative. Despite being a crime lord, Lee was seemingly a kind and generous man. The Feast project displayed healing powers for people of various illnesses, although the cause of this healing was actually unknown, but it turned out to be Lee himself. The public knows that the person known as Martin Lee was an illegal Chinese immigrant who attempted to travel to America to be with his wife. In China, he ran a factory, but because of his lack of resources to bribe the Communist Party, he could not develop his business and grew tired of that country. Although this Martin Lee is not actually Martin Lee, but a former smuggler who just used Lee's identity after he died. Mr. Negative first came into conflict with Spider-Man when he made a power play towards taking control of New York's criminal underworld by attempting to wipe out all existing members of the Carnali and Maggia crime families, using a DNA-specific bioweapon called Devil's Breath. Mr. Negative is also responsible for the creation of ANTI-VENOM, and while he was featured in the 2018 Spider-Man game, it's been like 3 years, so he needs to show up again. And at 7, The Spot. As a scientist working for the Kingpin, Dr. Owen was assigned to reproduce the radiation levels of the Vigilante cloak to find a way to artificially mimic his powers. Working late one night, he actually succeeded, creating a solid black circular portal. In doing so, however, the drain on the city's power became so great a blackout washed over the city, causing the portal to shimmer and destabilize. Fearful of losing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Owen stepped into it, which was a horrible idea. The power shortage caused the portal to send him into a different dimension, a place of half darkness and half light, kinda like my mind. When Owen emerged back in his lab, his body had undergone a radical transformation. The portals from the other dimension had adhered to his skin, covering him from head to toe in black spots. But just think about how crazy OP this villain villain is, alright? He has the ability to control these portals. Like, if the man wanted to decapitate you, instantly he could. Best doctor in a sense, I guess. That's still horrifying. The Spider-Man in the 90s cartoon would use these portals against Ohm, but if he had just decided that he wanted to just destroy him, he could have. And Spider-Man would have had nothing to do. So, yeah, I want to see him make an appearance again, somehow. And at 6, Spider-Side. Spider-Side is a more obscure and odd Spider-Man villain, but I still think he would be pretty badass. Being first introduced as Spider-Side in New Warriors number 61, this version of Peter Parker is one of the clones made by Dr. Miles Warren, because we all know how much we love clones, which is an entirely separate villain that caused the whole clone debacle and creation of Scarlet Spider and a whole lot of other things. What's notable about Spider-Side, however, is not only him having all of Spider-Man's powers, but also the ability to stretch and warp his body at will, similar to Mr. Fantastic. Spider-Side is certainly deadly as well, helping Jackal to release a virus in Springfield, Pennsylvania, resulting in the deaths of 2,600 people. But either way, Spider-Side, with all the abilities of Spider-Man and Mr. Fantastic, makes him pretty damn powerful, so I want to see him come back. They didn't do much with him, okay? And I like the name Spider-Side. Any evil Spider-Man, really, just bring me more. Halfway through into number 5, Red Goblin. After the collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D., the Carnage symbiote was secured in the Lock Box, a privately run vault at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Agents Crane and Coleman infiltrated the Lock Box and stole the symbiote, delivering it to their employer, Norman Osborn. Yeah, you see where this is going. After receiving the symbiote, Osborn bonded with it to become the new Carnage, hoping that it would be the key to regaining his Green Goblin persona. While the symbiote initially seized control of him, Norman offered to teach it more nuanced and sadistic ways to kill, an offer that the symbiote eagerly accepted. The fact that you know more sadistic ways to kill people than a freaking mad symbiote is a whole other topic though, dude. The symbiote turned over control to its new host, restoring his appearance and purging his body of the nanites, preventing him from augmenting himself with Goblin formula. Osborn used the symbiote to kill Phil Urich, and after pretending to be mortally wounded in a rematch against Spider-Man as the Green Goblin, unveiled his new partner by transforming into the monstrous Red Goblin. Osborn used the symbiote to great effect, incapacitating Spider-Man's allies and loved ones, and bonding a portion of this symbiote to his grandson to turn him into the new Goblin child. Spidey was only able to defeat Red Goblin by taunting Osborn, saying that killing him would only give Carnage the credit and not him, which caused Osborn to remove the symbiote from himself. So he couldn't defeat Red Goblin, he had to defeat Osborn. Yeah, this is one of my favorite Carnage versions, so I want to see this come back, please. Like the next Venom movie. Or a No Way Home. And at number 4, Demogoblin. After losing fights with Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, Jason Philip Macendale Jr., aka Hobgoblin, took advantage of the Inferno Crisis by following several demons back to their lair and confronting their demonic lord Natshir. Macendale wanted enough power to defeat his enemies, and offered his soul to the demon in exchange for such power. When the demon stopped laughing, he decided that Macendale's effort was worth something even if his soul wasn't, and he had him possessed. This gave Macendale the physical strength that he craved, coupled with superhuman speed and endurance. Unfortunately, I guess you could say for him at least, the demon who possessed him proved to be incompatible, and the two fought many a battle for control over Macendale's physical form until the demon literally ripped himself out of his human host and began a separate existence as the Demogoblin, a form of anti-hero in a sense who would kill anyone who has sinned, which is basically everyone. Except he would stay away from children, even dying to protect one. Getting close to the end in at number 3, Shocker. Okay, he's not really a forgotten villain, but Herman Schultz's parents died when his younger brother Marty was a boy. From a young age, Schultz turned to a life of crime, and soon realized that he wasn't really good at it, having been arrested several times. After one particular robbery gone wrong, Herman was arrested again, but was sent to the prison workshop, where he used the resources around him to build projects and build gauntlets that sent out shock waves which quickly opened safes as well, giving him a much needed one-up on the authorities. Now, I know what you're thinking, okay? Why am I talking about Shocker? Everyone knows who he is. Well, have you seen the MCU version of this guy? Okay, we need a better one. Come on, give me an actual Shocker. Shocker has the ability to shock his enemies with his handheld vibro shock units, but because the vibrations were so fierce, he has to wear a heavily insulated suit, which kind of looks like a mattress, but still. During his first outing as the self-styled Shocker, he ran into and defeated Spider-Man. Plus, I mean, he's the Shocker, I shock people. Give me a better version, okay? With a seemingly minute introduction into the MCU, I want to see a better version. Do it! Penultimately, in at number 2, The Swarm. Fritz von Meyer was once a fascist scientist, the details of which remain unrevealed. But von Meyer fled Germany at the end of World War II to settle in South America. A work expert on toxic poisons and apiculture, which is beekeeping, he continued his research on the breeding patterns of killer bees. One day, he found a hive unlike any other he had ever seen. The bees exhibited no fear and were unusually passive, and seemed to have a highly developed sense of intelligence. Believing that a nearby meteorite bombardment had somehow mutated these bees, von Meyer built a device that he hoped would reawaken the bees' killer instincts so that they could serve him. However, when they were no longer passive, they began to swarm all over von Meyer, killing him. In the midst of his death though, his consciousness was shredded, dissipating into the swarms of bees. Thus, von Meyer became an aggregate being, like a living embodiment of the swarm. Kind of like Spider-Man, but with bees. This is probably one of the weirdest but most fascinating villains I've ever seen, and certainly deserves a comeback. However, not as much as number 1, but I gotta admit, being named Fritz and then having your agony possess a whole load of bees, that's getting too close to FNAF for me, okay? I don't like it. Finally, in at number 1, Spider-Carnage. We all knew this was going to be on the list, at least if you know me and my favorite Spider-Man villains. However, Spider-Carnage isn't just a Spider-Man villain, he's an alternate version of Spider-Man. Hailing from one of the many Earths, this character was introduced in the 90s Spider-Man animated series, my favorite Spider-Man animated series, might I add. This Peter's life was actually very similar to the main Spider-Man, except this version also lost Aunt May and developed a resentment for humanity. And then he had to deal with a clone, which definitely sucked. Until he and the clone learned that the one who they thought was the clone, who was going by Ben Reilly at the time, could actually be the real Peter Parker, and that broke this Peter. A Carnage symbiote from another universe actually sensed this hatred and resentment, and through a portal created by Jonathan Ohm, it bonded with this Peter, driving him even more insane, and then started calling himself Spider-Carnage. From my understanding, this character hasn't been seen since that final episode of the series, and I want him to make a comeback. Please, add this character to the MCU. Like, if we're getting 3 Spider-Man, why not just throw Carnage from some other universe in there too, and then have him bond with like Toby's, because apparently Toby's a bad person now. Even though I'm dressed like the Spider-Man 3 version, yes, that's exactly why I wore this suit today, specifically for that reason. But an intense shocker. Herman Schultz's parents died when his younger brother Marty was a boy. From a young age, Schultz turned to a life of crime. However, he soon realized that he wasn't really good at it, having been arrested several times. After one robbery gone wrong, he got arrested again, but was sent to a prison workshop, where he used the resources around him to build gauntlets that sent out shock waves, which quickly opened safes as well, giving himself a one-up on the authorities, a much needed one. Now I know what you're thinking, but how could a guy named Herman be any form of powerful? Well, the Shocker had the ability to shock his enemies with his handheld vibro shock units. But because the vibrations were so fierce, he wore a heavily insulated suit, and during his first outing as the self-styled Shocker, he ran into and defeated Spider-Man. Plus, I mean, he's the Shocker. He shocks people. In at 9, Hydro-Man. Morris Bench was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. He began working as a crewman on a cargo ship, but he was accidentally knocked overboard by Spider-Man while a powerful experimental generator was being lowered into the ocean for testing. Exposed to the energy conversion process of the generator while being bombarded with volcanic gas, Bench's cellular structure was altered. When he was rescued from the depths though, his body began extruding great quantities of some watery substance, which Bench first attributed to just being sweat. Annoyed by the incessant dripping, Bench went to a local pub to stir up trouble, finding none, but he was astonished to learn that he could convert his entire physical form into basically water. While he may just be a form of Sandman, being able to convert to water instead of sand, he certainly seems more powerful to me. There is water basically everywhere, and our bodies are made of 70% water, so if Bench was able to tap into the water that is in his enemies' bodies, that would be a freaking nightmare. Not to mention a horrible sight. In at 8, the Kingpin. A crime boss is one thing. A crime boss that to the public is a well-respected philanthropist and businessman is something else. Especially a businessman who is like 300 pounds of muscle. Wilson Fisk is an absolute madman who runs most of the New York and Las Vegas criminal underworld. However, things get even more intense after his wife is killed so that he doesn't retire. After the murder of his wife, not only did he resume leadership of his former organization, but he also turned over the files on other criminal criminal leaders to law enforcement through the costumed crime fighter of Daredevil, now with the motive of ridding himself of any rivals, and the ploy actually worked, and as a result of the evidence in the files, many crime leaders, both inside and outside the Magia, were convicted. In the ensuing power vacuum, the Kingpin rebuilt his coalition stronger than before. He moved on to control a great majority of non-Magia East Coast gangs dealing in conventional crimes, and the Kingpin's organization became stronger than any single Magia family in the New York area could ever withstand. We love a savvy businessman. And it's 7, Spider-Side. Spider-Side is a more obscure and odd Spider-Man villain that I still think would give the hero a run for his money nowadays. Being first introduced as Spider-Side in New Warriors number 61, this version of Peter Parker is one of the clones made by Dr. Miles Warren, an entirely separate villain that caused the whole clone debacle and the introduction of Ben Reilly and the Scarlet Spider. But what's notable about Spider-Side is not only him having all of Spider-Man's powers, but also the ability to stretch and warp his body at will, similar to Mr. Fantastic. Spider-Side is certainly deadly as well, helping Jackal to release a virus in Springfield, Pennsylvania, which resulted in the deaths of over 2,600 people, which Homer Simpson was definitely not happy about. But either way, Spider-Side, with all the abilities of Spider-Man and Mr. Fantastic, makes him pretty damn powerful for a villain that not really many people know about. And at 6, KRAVEN the Hunter. KRAVINOFFS found that he had a great talent for finding employment in Kenya, Africa. KRAVINOFFS began his career using the typical tools of the hunter, but over time he developed a preference to take down large animals with his bare hands. So, you know, already a psycho in the making. After meeting a voodoo witch doctor named Calypso, KRAVINOFFS took a herbal potion which enhanced his physical powers and gave him strength, speed, and senses to match a jungle cat. The potion also extended his life greatly, keeping his health and vitality for years to come. At some point, the notion of big game hunting became a bore to the hunter, so his associate Chameleon, who was later revealed to be his half-brother, proposed to KRAVEN that he hunt Spider-Man, and thus gave KRAVEN a new purpose in life. KRAVEN gained additional powers by drinking more rare and exotic jungle elixirs given to him by his voodoo priestess lover Calypso. These elixirs gave him the strength and speed of a savage beast, and all the better to catch Spider-Man with, right? Despite being assisted by the Chameleon, his scheme failed and he was deported from the US, but he would definitely come back. Halfway through into number 5, TOXIN. Born from Carnage as the 1000th symbiote in its lineage, TOXIN was feared to be the strongest and most dangerous of their race by both Venom and Carnage. Shortly after being born, the symbiote united with police officer Pat Mulligan. Years later, the symbiote was removed from Mulligan by Blackheart, who beat Pat Mulligan to death in a gutter. With the help of Venom, Jack-o'-lantern took it to its boss, Crime Master. Crime Master, though, found the perfect host in Eddie Brock, who he forced to become Toxin's host. You know, Eddie Brock, the former host of Venom. After bonding with Eddie, Toxin took over its host and worked with the Savage Six, attacking its grandfather symbiote Venom. And with Toxin seemingly coming to the big screen in the future, being introduced in Let There Be Carnage, okay, well, Pat Mulligan was introduced, and then he had some like freaky thing happen with his eyes near the end of the movie, but still, it's very close to it. This guy is also just a freaking freak, okay? He can grow fangs and claws when he's angry. It just happens. It's not something that he thinks of, it just happens. Something that Venom and Carnage are unable to do. However, Toxin is also unable to be tracked by Venom or Carnage, as well as being immune to Spider-Man's spider sense. So this dude is hella off the radar, which only makes things freakier. And at 4, ANTI-VENOM. When Eddie Brock separated from the Venom symbiote, traces of it were still left in his body. Later though, suffering from cancer, Brock started working as a volunteer in the Feast Center. Martin Lee, the founder of Feast, and the alter ego of the supervillain Mr. Negative, used his powers to cure Eddie's cancer. But in the process, Lee accidentally infused the remnants of the symbiote in Eddie's bloodstream with his power, and fused them to his white blood cells, creating a new hybrid symbiote which manifested when the Venom symbiote attempted to leave its then current host Matt Gargan and return to Eddie. This new symbiote, dubbed Anti-Venom by Eddie, demonstrated tremendous healing powers and other powers that differ from the Venom symbiote, as well as having an inverted color scheme, or a negative color scheme, if you will, such as producing antibodies that can cure any known disease and removing any other impurities within a human body. Unlike other symbiotes though, this symbiote is completely mindless, and Eddie Brock is in full control of its actions. This symbiote was destroyed when it was used as the cure for the Spider-Virus, which had turned various characters into human spider hybrids. However, it was remade as Agent Anti-Venom after Flash Thompson ended up getting soaked with anti-venom serum. that's a whole other story. Getting close to the end, and in number 3, Shathra. An inhabitant of the astral plane, Shathra is the Spider-Wasp to Peter Parker's Spider. She learned of Spider-Man when he strayed from the safe path during a visit to the astral plane to locate the interdimensional kidnapper known as the Shade. Shathra immediately realized Spider-Man's true nature and determined that he would make the perfect meal for her hungry young hatchlings. Great! First introduced in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2 number 46 in 2002, Shathra quickly followed Spider-Man's scent back to Earth. She engaged Spider-Man in a battle that demonstrated her clearly superior speed and strength, but Spider-Man was able to use his superior knowledge of New York City to find temporary escape. But of course he only knew that it was a matter of time before Shathra would locate him once more. Shathra turned the game in a new direction though, changing to a human form and adopting the name Sharon Keller. And she went on TV to pose as Spider-Man's jitted lover. She went on TV and revealed a series of convincing and humiliating details, and of course this made Mary Jane upset. So, spurred on by Mary Jane's distress, Peter rose to the taunt. He gatecrashed the studio interview and attacked Sharon Keller in full view of, live TV. Shathra reverted to her Spider-Wasp form, but her gambit had achieved its goal of pushing Spider-Man to act on pure instinct, which ended up making him the prey, because they were at their actual primordial positions. He was the prey, she was the hunter because she's the Spider-Wasp. You get it, you get it. But ultimately, in at number 2, Chameleon. Being the first villain Spider-Man ever faced way back in Amazing Spider-Man number 1 from 1963 and my costume from yesterday, I think that Chameleon is a more underrated villain than he should be. Being able to look like anyone at any time is pretty damn overpowered, especially when you can use it to look like Spider-Man and even use suction cups to stick to walls, even if it's slightly unrealistic. This character is especially powerful when he has superpowers, like in the 90s animated Spider-Man series, where after Alistair Smythe infused him with a techno-organic virus, could simply look at you and end up transforming into you. It's actually insanely overpowered when you look at it like that, since he can also transform his clothes. He could be fleeing from Spider-Man and turn the corner and then be anyone, so it's certainly someone to fear, unless they use the original version who has to use disguises and makeup to look like anyone they want, since that process takes time and can't be turned on and off. And finally, in at number 1, the Spot. As a scientist working for the Kingpin, Dr. Owen was assigned to reproduce the radiation levels of the Vigilante Cloak to find a way to artificially mimic his powers. Working late one night, he succeeded, creating a solid black circular portal. In doing so, however, the drain on the city's power became so great that a blackout washed over the city, causing the portal to shimmer and destabilize. Fearful of losing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Owen stepped into it, and the power shortage caused the portal to send him into a different dimension, a place of half darkness and half light. When Owen emerged back into his lab, his body had undergone a radical transformation. The portals from the other dimension had adhered to his skin, covering him with black spots from head to toe. The reason this is absolutely terrifying, and is the most overpowered villain you wouldn't expect, is because he now had the ability to control these portals. If the man wanted to decapitate you, he easily could. Just close a portal at any part of your body, and then boom, amputation. Around your neck, you're dead. It's horrifying. Spider-Man in the 90s cartoon would use these portals to land a punch on Owen, but if Owen just decided to close it or he lost his focus to keep them open, that would have been real bad. Just stay away from this guy, straight up. Don't even try to fight him.